Britain didn't lose its empire on the battlefield. It signed it away in a series of contracts, audits, and debt agreements while the bombs were still falling. On December 29, 2006, the British Treasury quietly transferred $83 million to the United States government. There were no ceremonies, no headlines, no speeches. That payment closed a debt account that had been opened in 1946, when World War II was already over. 61 years after victory, Britain finished paying for the war. 3 generations of British taxpayers had been charged interest for survival. But what that final payment really marked was not the cost of defeating Nazi Germany. It was the final installment on a deal that had stripped Britain of its wealth, its leverage, and ultimately its empire. World War II did not bankrupt Britain by accident. It was engineered through policy, debt, and forced liquidation, carefully executed while Britain had no alternatives. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States oversaw the largest non-violent transfer of wealth the world had ever seen. Britain entered the war as the planet's dominant creditor nation, presiding over an empire that covered roughly a quarter of Earth's land surface. It exited the war financially hollowed out, its gold gone. Its overseas investments sold, its military bases leased away for nearly a century, and saddled with over $30 billion in debt to Washington, nearly $500 billion in today's money. Yet the true cost went far beyond numbers. Britain paid with its global position. What is often remembered as generous aid was in reality an asset extraction operation disguised as friendship. To understand how this happened, you have to return to December 8, 1940. Winston Churchill wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt that would define Britain's future. German submarines were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. British cities were burning under nightly air raids. The army needed planes, tanks, ammunition, fuel, everything. And then Churchill admitted the truth: Britain was out of money. Not low on cash. Completely exhausted. The Treasury could no longer pay American suppliers. In just 7 months of war, Britain had burned through the wealth accumulated over centuries. This letter is often portrayed as a desperate plea for help between allies. But a closer look reveals something else. Churchill was not asking for charity. He was negotiating the terms under which Britain would liquidate itself in exchange for survival. Before the war, Britain was the wealthiest nation on Earth. Its overseas investments alone were worth tens of billions. British firms owned railways, mines, plantations, and oil fields across multiple continents. London was the center of global finance. The pound sterling functioned as the world's reserve currency. Britain also held one of the largest gold reserves on the planet. And yet, by late 1940, all of it was effectively gone. The mechanism that drained Britain was American law. When war broke out in 1939, the United States declared neutrality. Congress passed laws intended to keep America out of European conflicts. But embedded within those laws was a clause that proved fatal to Britain's finances: cash and carry. Belligerents could buy American weapons, but only if they paid upfront in cash and transported the goods themselves. No loans, no credit. Gold or dollars first, equipment later. Britain had no choice. American industry was the only source capable of supplying what the war demanded. To comply, Britain launched what became known as Operation Fish. Beginning in mid-1940, British warships transported nearly the entirety of the nation's gold reserves and securities across submarine-infested waters to vaults in North America. It was the largest movement of physical wealth ever undertaken. Within months, the gold was gone. Yet the orders continued. Planes, tanks, munitions, all contracted without any remaining means to pay. This is where the mythology of Lend-Lease begins. Popular history suggests Roosevelt devised a clever workaround to help Britain, lending equipment the way one lends a garden hose to a neighbor. But behind closed doors, the reality looked nothing like that story. The negotiations were dominated not by sentiment, but by the U.S. Treasury, led by Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. His priority was simple. Britain would receive no aid until every available asset had been sold. Before Congress even approved Lend-Lease, Morgenthau demanded a full accounting of British wealth, public and private, domestic and overseas. Britain was required to expose the financial holdings of its citizens while fighting for national survival. British negotiators protested that selling long-term investments during wartime would destroy future income. They warned of fire, sale prices, and permanent damage. Morgenthau did not care. If Britain still had assets, he argued, American taxpayers should not foot the bill. To convince Congress that Britain was truly broke, Morgenthau forced a symbolic sacrifice. A major American industrial firm owned by British interests was ordered to be sold immediately. The sale was compulsory and rushed. American bankers, fully aware of Britain's desperation, drove the price down to nearly half its true value. The proceeds went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This pattern repeated across industries. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated over $1 billion in American investments. Only then did Lend-Lease funds begin to flow. Even before that, Britain had already surrendered strategic ground. In exchange for 50 outdated destroyers, ships the U.S. Navy barely wanted, Britain granted America 90 9-year leases on military bases stretching across the Atlantic and Caribbean. This deal handed the United States long-term control over critical maritime routes and laid the foundation for American global military dominance. Britain traded permanent strategic assets for temporary survival. When Lend-Lease finally passed in March 1941, it was framed as altruism. In practice, it was conditional support designed to reshape the postwar world. Buried within the agreement was a clause requiring Britain to dismantle its system of imperial trade preferences after the war. That system was the economic glue holding the empire together. Removing it meant opening imperial markets to American competition. British negotiators understood the implication immediately. The empire could not survive under those terms. But with German bombers overhead, Britain signed. As the war dragged on, the imbalance deepened. American factories produced weapons while also flooding global markets with consumer goods. British industry focused entirely on war production, abandoning export markets it would never regain. By the time victory came, global finance had shifted permanently from London to New York. Gold reserves sat in American vaults. The dollar replaced the pound. Then came the final shock. Just days after Japan surrendered, President Truman abruptly terminated Lend-Lease. Ships already at sea were ordered back. There was no transition. Britain's economy, still structured for war, collapsed overnight. Facing starvation and default, Britain had one option: borrow. John Maynard Keynes traveled to Washington to plead for relief. He argued Britain deserved a grant, not a loan. He appealed to shared sacrifice and moral obligation. The Americans refused. What they offered instead was a loan with conditions designed to break Britain's remaining defenses. Chief among them was sterling convertibility. The moment the pound became freely exchangeable, it collapsed. Within weeks, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars and was forced to suspend the policy in humiliation. The consequences were immediate. Britain abandoned its global security role, handing responsibility to the United States. The Truman Doctrine was born. Britain formally ceased to be a superpower. The pound was devalued, living standards fell, and the debt remained. For 6 decades, Britain paid interest to the United States. Only in 2006 did the final payment clear. This was not an accident of history. It was a transfer of power executed through contracts, loans, and leverage. Britain was not conquered by Germany. It was financially conquered by its ally. And the method did not end there. The same framework, aid with conditions, debt with strings, markets opened under pressure, has been applied repeatedly since. Crisis creates dependency. Dependency invites concessions. Concessions transfer sovereignty. Understanding this story is not about rewriting World War II or assigning moral labels. It is about recognizing how modern power operates. Empires today are not built through invasion. They are built through balance sheets. Britain survived the war, but it paid with its future. And the bill came due for 61 years.